So I think that we can probably get started, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is, if you're familiar with our normal webinars, this is a little bit abnormal for us. We are conducting this as a Q&A panel with all of our experts here who will introduce themselves in a moment. So we have some topics that we're going to cover, but the primary focus is your questions. So please put them in the chat. Please put them in the Q&A box. Please raise your hand and talk to us. We really love that. We can unmute you if you raise your hand, and then everybody can kind of just have a nice chat. We are recording this as well, just so you know. And I think that's all that I needed to say. Jeannie, do you want to start off with introducing yourself, and then everybody else can?
Sure. I'm Jeannie Warner. I do actually take LinkedIn connection requests as long as you're not trying to sell me anything. I started at IBM building a security operations center in 2001, and I worked at IBM for 9 years. 4 of those years in the security operations center. Up through, I was the technical lead there. Up through, I've been the global security operations manager at Dimension Data as well. So SOCs are my favorite thing to talk about and run, as well as I've seen them in various different sizes, from the one guy with a rack in the closet to 17 people, 24/7, 365. So this is one of my favorite topics. I'm excited to be here. Jason Mermelli, you want to go next? You're on to my right.
Sure. I'm Jason Mermelli. I've been with Exabeam for about 2 years. I've been a lead in a SOC at the New York Stock Exchange and built out Verizon's a SOC leveraging Exabeam for the last 7 years.
Eric, you're next as I go around my window.
Oh man, I was hoping I'd be last, but Eric Olson. I've been in everything from IT, law enforcement to security operations. Spent several years in IT, became a police officer after that over in Houston, and spent 4 years as a patrol officer, 2 years as a detective investigator. They didn't want us paid detective pay, so they paid us an investigator pay. Moved into cybercrime, cyber terrorism, and hostage negotiation tech support on the side. So I worked in our fusion center down in Houston, which was pretty fun. Got to work with the federal agencies, do the if you see something, say something campaign, deal with cybercrime, cyber terrorism incidents, and active investigations down there. So that was a lot of fun. Moved into security operations over at a Fortune 50 company. Did tier 3 support there and tier 3 investigations, threat intel, security investigations, all kinds of, connecting the dots with HR and all the different organizations. Moved into more of a wear many hats role and bought Exabeam from there, became a customer for 3 years, and then decided to join Exabeam on the dark side. So been at Exabeam for about 3 years now.
Welcome to the dark side. We have nice black t-shirts.
Exactly.
Bobby Castile, tell them about yourself. And you need to unmute your whole computer, not just your Zoom button. Nope, still not there. If you have a Mac, it's the upper right little. Now you're muted.
No.
It broke right as we got into the session. Fantastic.
I promise you all, we heard his voice earlier.
There we go.
There we go.
I want to start by saying here's sympathy for anybody that grew up on one kind of operating system or laptop and then got suddenly moved to another. I was years on ThinkPads because IBM, and when I first moved to the West Coast, they introduced me to an Apple MacBook, and I was like, WTF is this? So it mutes whenever anybody knows. So tell us about yourself, Bobby.
I'm Bobby Castile. Started my IT career in the Marine Corps. Moved from the Marine Corps. Went to college for cybersecurity. Wound up getting pretty ingrained through the IT path. Built a SOC for a local power company out here in the Northwest. I have a little bit of a different take on building a couple SOCs, and also have worked with 2 different MSSPs and built them from the ground up as well.
Awesome. All right, well, we were going to jump in, and why don't we just kind of The way we're going to structure this is I'm going to throw some questions around the area that we had pre-asked for your convenience. And then we'll each sound off on our opinions and how we did it in the areas we're most familiar with. And if you have questions or comments on there, I will be keeping an eye on the chat to bring them up on each particular topic. So shall we just go ahead and start out? First one, finding humans. I love this one because every once in a while we're in the Bay Area here and I see somebody's SOC advertising for, we're looking for a security operations center, tier 1 must be 5 years experience. And I say, pardon me, I'm allowed to swear again, WTF people, because there are no SOCers with 5 years. Once you have 5 years experience, you're either a tier 3, a security analyst, you move into the engineering, you find, certified ethical hacking. It's a pipe dream. So let's talk about the different places we have found SOCers and what the prerequisite, areas tended to make people better success. Jason, you can go first again.
Sure. From my point of view, I was lucky enough to have a professor in my security group that was the lead with engineering and was able to actually assist me by bringing a lot of his students that were in the security program. That was one path that we took. I did also had contact with other security professors to bring in students that would fit a tier 1 position. The other things that we would look at were B-sides or some kind of events that we would recruit from at Verizon.
Eric, where did you find baby SOCers?
So I actually got pulled into a SOC. I worked at the Fusion Center and they kind of took a chance on me because I had a bunch of IT experience and computer experience, and that was sometimes rare where I was. So they pulled me in and I helped with the cyber investigation, cybercrime, the federal agencies, and worked that angle. When I got pulled into the SOC at the Fortune 50, I didn't have to go from tier 1 to tier 2. I went straight to tier 3 because of my background and my master's degree in digital forensics. So they pulled me based on experience and education. So it was kind of a combination. The people that I'm hiring now that we're pulling into Exabeam, some of them have technical backgrounds and investigation experiences, technical support. So it's good to pull people in with multiple backgrounds. And as I worked in the SOC, we definitely tried to pull people in that had kind of they were willing to learn, they were willing to adapt. They might have networking background or IT background, but it was always good to find people that were willing to learn and adapt to that role.
Exactly. Bobby, what's your experience with recruiting folks? Where do you find them?
So I took a different approach in the past when I worked for a power company. We had a physical SOC, which would monitor all the substations and all the physical power grid devices. So what we did is that when we were hiring for that role, we hired people that had a decent background with computer skills. And then what we did is we trained them in both areas, so they would rotate watching physical and watching cyber throughout their shift. And it made it a lot easier to kind of combine, because when you're looking at it from a monitoring perspective from a physical SOC, there's a lot of things that bleed over into the cyberspace. So we really worked on, training, getting those guys up to speed, teaching them basic security practices, what to watch out for, how to do that level 1 triage, gaining the information, then escalating up to level 2 and level 3. And then we would also partner with local colleges, local trade schools, and then also kind of beat the streets with some of, like Jason said, some like B-sides and some of the other conventions that were local in the area.
Cool. Well, IBM is similar in some ways. I came from a background of I'd been a Unix sysadmin at a help desk, and then I'd worked in a network operations center. In my first interview, he walked down and said, "What do you know about security?" And I looked the nice man in the eye and I said, "Not a damn thing." And he laughed and said, "What do you think about security?" And we talked about what I'd learned as a sysadmin. And You know more than you think you do. And I asked him years later because he had come up through, let's see, he'd been Army and then police, then FBI, then IBM. And he said, you were the only person that didn't lie. And I wanted to say something out there of those that prevaricate or try to fake something versus if you don't know, you don't know, but you can go look it up. And the integrity matters a lot where you find people. We hired from Knox, we hired system admins, we hired desktop support. And once when a VP came to me and said, I want you to hire my babysitter, as we all know, you do what your VP says. I said, okay, we will hire your babysitter who had no computer experience, but it's going to take a couple extra weeks because we had to get some basic concept down. So let's all talk about some basic concepts and understanding. Like I like to say for baby SOCers, the first thing I try to explain is how computers talk to each other. So I literally always started with the OSI path and then some basic network plus. Jason, where do you go when you're starting them out?
Yeah, so it's a good situation. Just like you, we have to train most of our personnel when we hire them, especially the tier one portions. One of the programs that we did invent at Verizon in our group was to basically train up these guys and have a lead or someone that they can look up to. Most of the training that we've got in the past was SANS, which is very expensive. So we focus a lot more on A+, a little bit of online stuff, and just learning through B-sides or, we're lucky in this day and age to have a lot of the DEF CON talks and stuff on YouTube now. So there's definitely a lot more room for new people to train on YouTube and understand what security is, where in the past, there was no YouTube when I was growing up. So it was definitely a harder situation for us to train those new SOC people or security people.
I wanted to stop and whore out Groupon for just a moment here. Go out to Groupon, everybody, because the CompTIA Network Plus and Security Plus are often a bundle of education on sale for dirt cheap. So just learning those things, especially if you're financing your own education or sideways move or trying to find a cheap way to get people some basic training, it's fantastic. All right, Eric, what did you do for your basic new soccer people and training?
A lot of the times when I was kind of pushed into a position, it was trial by fire. What I've tried to do when I've attempted to train people is not do the trial by fire approach. It works in some circumstances with the hands-on, but getting them some type of formal training or sitting with them on working sessions and kind of walking through things. Is it always effective? No, but having that kind of outside training with, if the organization has the budget for SANS or the budget for CompTIA certifications, things like that, do some outside training. I think we've talked about in the past, there's organizations out there that have free training or, pay what you can training that you can find online that can teach you about basic security skills and investigations. It's always good to just have the different ways of approaches that some of these security operations centers can approach and the basic foundational skills of, how to look at, networks or how to look at security investigations. It really depends on the focus you're wanting them to get into. If it's something like insider threat, it might be a different world than, tier 1, tier 2 analyst.
I love that. And I'm going to do an aside briefly over to Tam and Sarah. You now have a to-do. I'd like you to poll all of us for our favorite free training courses and where to look. And we should put it as a community post, don't you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Absolutely. I mean, everybody's got some favorite stuff. Some of it's cheap. I am a big fan of cheap out there because I know many people are trying to move sideways on their own budget. Bobby, what are your favorite ways to train people up? Find new people, train them up right.
It's kind of the same thing. A lot of it's the CompTIA stuff. But what I did a lot was working sessions. You would sit with them, we would train them, we would go over scenarios. I mean, for us, that was the best way when we were from our physical SOC. That was the best way to kind of help them grow, would be to sit there and go through sessions. And as we brought in new people, as we're pulling like from the help desk or pulling from server administration or network administration, it helped bring those senior people in that have like that deeper background. So as we work sessions, we would start like mentoring programs. And I'm a big proponent of trying to find someone that you can mentor and work on that aspect side of it to learn and to grow. I still have some of those guys still ping me to this day, and that was over like 5 years ago I did that.
Andrew Taylor was asking help desk, which absolutely help desk is a basic understanding. We at IBM hired a lot of help desk people that had done that because it's not just understanding your environment. There is a process and a way of thinking that help desk is like, okay, what were you doing when you first saw the problem? What was who have you told about the problem? What other things made you think they were related by strange behaviors? So help desk and desktop support really is a fantastic resource because troubleshooting are them. They understand the process. They understand, sometimes the environment, sometimes they can be new. But I was in North Dakota once at a university up there, and they had a single university server that handled all of their bursar information, and in a partition, the local police department information, and in another partition, state police department. And one of the people at the table was a secretary who had the project to move everybody from McAfee endpoint to Symantec endpoint. And she earned her seat on the table by reading the manual. Can't say enough things about just reading all of the details and finding it out. Yeah, you can come at it from a lot of different angles. And I think we want to say there is no one true path here, but help desk is fantastic if they've known how to sit and get information out of people, especially in what are all the things and how are all of the questions related, because sometimes it's asking what questions, right, guys?
Yeah, Jeannie, I want to add in there too. So, when I was looking to hire personnel, I didn't always look for someone that had a CSSP or full understanding of security, right? My basic understanding was, do they know how to diagnose a security and understand from point 1A to B, how do you get there? Like you said, help desk, right? They're diagnosing these issues. They need to figure out what happened, what's the cause of it. And that was a big improvement when we were hiring security people, that they knew how to research stuff, where someone just took a test, they didn't always help them in the field.
And I'd like to add to that as well, is that it's, if you could find people that have understanding on problem solving skills, understand how to get solve a problem from point A to point B, because that's all it is when you're triaging alerts. It's like, where did it come from? It's understanding the who, what, where, when, why, and then the how. They can understand that, then they'll go far.
I also recommend, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if I interview somebody and they tell me they have a lab and they do X, Y, and Z and they're working on this on the side, or they've built out their own free SIM on, a virtual VM or a box they have just sitting around, then that gives them a lot more credibility on, them seeing and understanding and trying to focus on the security skills that need to succeed.
Mark, did you have something you were going to say? Otherwise, I'm going to mute Mark. Yeah, there we go.
I muted him.
Perfect. Yeah, those are all absolutely the cases, but you never know what you're going to get. I once had he was a regular network architect hanging out in a bar, and he'd reached the top of his career ladder. And he's like, yeah, I can't seem to break this dollar level that he really wanted to do. And I'm like, well, if you come work for me, and it's shift work, which you're not used to doing. You're used to being, you're an architect. You're here in your field. You're going to be here. But if you come work for me, it's shift work. Show up at 6 a.m, do your job, and don't bitch about it. You have knowledge that my team needs, and they have knowledge that they can give you. If you work for me for a year and a half, I'll make you 50% more expensive. And 2 months in, he was complaining about this and that. I'm like, we talked about this. And he's like, I'm your right. I'm shutting up. And I left Dimension Data, but he reached out and said, I am now worth 50% more. I just got a job. So security is a great way but you have to pay your dues. You have to understand the operations. You have to kind of look all of those different people.
Yeah, I
So,
just saw Antonio's question in the chat about criminology graduates. They have a good mindset to evaluate alerts and risks. I highly recommend criminology graduates. I came from, IT, law enforcement. Uh, I would recommend them all day because I know that some of the investigators, they may not have, some of the cyber experience, but they can learn and they can adapt and they can look at it holistically in the investigation or the alert triage and understanding of that triage process. So, um, yeah, highly recommend that route.
absolutely. And at IBM, we were basically an extension of the incident response team. We all spent a week in classes doing forensic investigation. What do you do it? How do you do it? A solid day on what are the laws? When do you have to say, right, hands off, you have to call law enforcement because you got one of these topics going on your servers that you may not know about. So cross training, always a plus, 2 thumbs up on that. All right, let's see. So I think we've covered over what do you want to get into for tier 1, some security frameworks. Let's talk a little bit about, let's see, finding yourself in the weeds and SOC alerts. There can be a lot coming through. And some of these are from those of us that have any kind of gray in our hair. We're aware that we used to monitor things like firewalls and IDS devices, maybe some HIDs, but now there's so much more. And a lot of people had early expertise just on firewalls. Taking that and troubleshooting an Active Directory is a completely different ball of wax. So thoughts on that of how they get to that next level, Jason?
I mean, going through the weeds of, sorry, well, it was going through the weeds of the
Yeah,
SOC.
there's a lot. There's how do you help them understand 2 million events? What do you have to respond to? What's important? How do you look at things?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess for each organization, it's kind of different. It goes with your risk tolerance and what field you're in. You know, it could be developing software, healthcare, banks. You know, you're really gonna push what your risk tolerance is. So, you know, bank wise, you know, um, I'll get an example. Let's go with my example, which would be at Verizon, right? I was part of the vehicle side, doing a lot of that stuff. So our biggest concern was, is someone saying malicious commands to cars? Um, that would be our biggest thing. Someone going to a website, you know, that's in IT that was malicious, sure, that could be a problem, but our biggest concern there was customers and making sure that they felt safe in the cars and nothing would happen like what happened with Jeep. So it's really based on your risk and understanding of your company.
Eric, thoughts?
Trying to figure out how to word this. So, I'll kind of go for, in the Fusion Center in law enforcement, we had a life and death situation. So it was basically, is this threat credible? And we triage from there. If somebody calls something in or if somebody says something online, we would investigate from there. And we may end up having a team go kick a door or something based on the credibility of the threat. With security operations, it was, much less life and death, but it was, there's situations where the company could be hacked and there could be a situation where somebody's gotten inside. So we had run books and playbooks for some of the tier 1 and tier 2 analysts, and you have that escalation process from tier 1 to tier 2. And most organizations, they'll have some type of, tier 3 analyst that will kind of overlook all that and be the mentor for those analysts. And that's, I had a mentor when I was at the Fortune 50 company, and basically he knew the entire environment. And if I needed to get into weeds, I didn't know what some machine was over at some IP range over here. I'd be like, what is this over here? And he'd off the top of his head, he could tell me. And it was great to have that person that I could refer to and say, okay, so this is connecting to this, and get into the weeds there, and get that kind of firsthand knowledge. That definitely helps, having a mentor where you're working and somebody that knows that overall architecture of the environment that can kind of grow up your skills and see what's in the weeds. So you'll have that basic foundation, but having somebody to be able to train you on the job definitely helps.
Bobby, what are your thoughts on this one?
A lot of it is it's about what crown jewels that you're trying to protect against. It just really depends, you know, help like for power is all about NERC and healthcare, it's all about HIPAA. It really depends on what you're trying to protect against. And to go off of Jason a little bit is that it's also what risks are you willing to accept as well. And from Eric's side as well, I agree with him. It's you got to have someone that knows the environment and that can train those newer guys up to understand the environment, what goes on, where, like from a medical perspective, where your imaging devices is that segmented correctly? What's the traffic patterns look like? Things of that nature.
There's a lot of pieces in different directions. I was once, when I was Symantec's MSSP, went in to talk to a would-be ISP, and I said, well, tell you what, we can look at your entire environment and everything and all your people and your endpoints for 1 year, and it's going to cost this much. Or you can figure out your 10% of the key, your crown jewels, as you said, and we can look at that for 3 years. Meanwhile, you should copy everything that we do, every process, every procedure, because they wanted to set up their own SOC, but they didn't know where to begin. So I just want to throw out there, sometimes start with a pro and come back, which there's a lot of pieces if you're building your first SOC to ask about in that way. It's not only how do you get through the mess of all the events, but what are you going to value? What are your crown jewels? So how many people do you need? Let's go on that one. I think how many people you need in our experience is there was an ISP once that had one real good security guy in a closet, but for a managed security service monitoring 500 people, we discovered the number was 17. So let's talk about how many people you need to do by different missions. So Jason, what are some missions that you've had with different staffing requirements?
That was an interesting thing at Verizon when we brought in different partners such as VW, Mercedes, and whatnot. There was definitely different requirements from a security point of view. Every company had a different idea of what they thought we should be doing for them. Where the point, like we just talked about, a CSISP is not going to be a tier 1 analyst. There's just no way. And one company actually did require that. So it took a lot of understanding and talking with them to understand what they were trying to achieve with that kind of comment. And it basically came down to is that they just wanted someone that wanted to be trained up and understood security more than, basic tier 1, which is understanding, right? In this field, we were protecting the cars and it was a big issue, especially being in the news from Jeep. So I understand what they're looking for, and we made them feel comfortable showing them our training programs.
Eric, your thoughts on how many people do you need in this SOC for protecting different areas in your experience? Because there's no one number, no right answer.
No, there's definitely no one number. We had the SOC that I worked on. Well, I'll go back to law enforcement, and we would be on call 24/7 for a week at a time. And I remember trying to go out the door after a long shift and basically putting my pants on backwards because I was so tired, and then realizing that I had to have some coffee, get going and get moving, but I was still on call and had to deal with the situation. When it came to the SOC after that, it was you'd be on call for certain situations, but you had a 24/7 staff where you have the people working overnight that are working alerts, and if they have issues, they contact the manager or the person on call that needs to assist. And usually that was a tier 3 analyst that needed to help out. So messaging from my phone at 11, 12 o'clock at night wasn't rare. But then going to a smaller organization, we had 2 engineers. It was me and another analyst that we were working the alerts. And I remember falling asleep at my desk at like 3:30 at night when I had an issue and finally finished the investigation, or getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to work on something, and realized that long term that was not going to be sustainable. So I went and looked for an MSSP that could help monitor and do 24/7 monitoring for the system, so that I didn't have to be up late at night and that we could have somebody actually watching those. So there's no easy answer. It's, if you're a small organization, there has to be a point where you realize you might need an MSSP, or you might need that supplemental workforce, or you might need additional staff based on budget. So
And I insert one thing before I ask you your thoughts on this one, Bobby. Be aware that if you're an organization that has people doing shift work, you may end up having to, by law, pay shift differential, not just say, well, their salary, because the type of work you have somebody do is how you pay them in America. Just throwing that out there. So if I was expecting Eric to be on call midnight to 8 a.m., I better be paying him a shift differential, even if he's a salaried person. Bobby, what you got?
It all depends on the environment. I've been a part of it's for me, I've been all part of small teams. And it depends on what other tools that you have in your environment that you're monitoring, whether it's an EDR solution, it's the SIM, you're using some kind of NetFlow device, things of that nature. It really is dependent on what the bulk of your environment is. And then also depending on like what your board wants to see too, from multiple different angles, from KPIs to alerts to things of that nature. You know, it all taxes on and it all weighs on your individual. So it's a balance, but I've noticed in the security space that we like to run lean and we like to try to do things with minimal amount of people as possible. And that also can hurt an environment pretty easily too, because you don't have enough people, you're wearing them out. And if you only have a team of 3 or 4, right? Someone's on call. If there's not an MSSP behind it, someone's on call once a month. So now you're taking away someone's, time with family or vacation time or things like that, because with a small team, it's hard to balance back and forth of, well, I need to switch this out, or I need to switch that out. So you have to be cognizant of that as well and try to figure out what works best. It's just all organization depending.
It really is. Small organizations can say, right, if I'm a small or medium business, maybe 9 to 5 is my important because that's my open hours. Maybe there's not much going on. If I come up in the morning, my website is down. If it's not the end of the world, then I'll work to figure out what happened. Versus absolutely, if you're monitoring other systems, we used to say 17 and somebody's like, why so many? I'm like, well, if I'm looking at 100 customers at the same time, that's more than one person staring at a sheet of glass, right? So I need this many people. You really do have to figure out how many systems can one person look at, follow, and troubleshoot. And it's good to start getting those numbers, because if you say a Verizon, for instance, will say, I need this many people, 2 dedicated here, 2 dedicated there. That's 4 people each shift, 3 shifts a day, 2 shifts a day. Do you move to 10 hours? There's a lot of things, and your mission statement can fuel a lot of those decisions as well.
So yeah, add into that too, kind of the KPI and how we did this at Verizon. So when I joined this company, which is bought by Verizon, so it was a very, very small security function there, maybe 3 to 4 people. We started off with the basics of basic logging, maybe 200 gigs here, 300. That's where KPI kept coming in, because the more data that we took on that the business wanted for more risk, to understand it, we needed more people. We went from 200 gigs to, I think it was up to like 3 terabytes at the end of the day before I left, from 3 people to 40 people on my team. So definitely KPIs do come into play, especially for false positives, because false positives are going to get larger with the more amount of data that you have coming in and understanding that data. So definitely it leverages us to hire more people to fill the SOC roles using those KPIs.
And I like to kind of piggyback off of Jason with the KPIs as well, is that when you have a system, especially from like a SIM perspective, it's really about if you can get that actionable data that you're looking at. Not all data is going to matter, right? It's really boils down to what actionable data that you are bringing into the system, what you want to see, what you want to look, what you want to view, because all logs are not the same. They each have a purpose and they all have something that you need or you don't need. So with the KPI stuff, a lot of it where we struggled with at my a couple previous jobs is that you would get people that would want to see how many denied firewall requests that you get in a day or a week. Is that really actionable though? Does that really matter compared to, I would want to see from a user perspective, how many denies and then followed up by a successful auth. I would think that that would be more actionable from a KPI perspective than just looking at denies or fails or who's scanning you from the outside, things of that nature. You don't want to waste your SOC analyst time with them pulling up non-actionable data.
Oh, can't agree with you enough on that. You can look at it times like, I don't care that much about a firewall doing their job. I once was in the middle of the morning calling out to state of New York, and I had the guy say, Jeannie, at 3 o'clock on a Saturday night, I don't want you to call me unless you see something outbound that's weird. Says, I'm hanging out. That's my girlfriend. That's my family time. It better be real. And that was something that kind of became one of our guiding principles of I don't count machines doing their job. I don't count firewall denies. I don't count that. I don't count Jeannie has her ability to change her password at 3 o'clock in the morning on a business trip and not remember and fat figure it 10 times. But as long as it's a human being fat fingering it, not a machine throwing 1,000 in a minute. Do you see the difference of what's dangerous versus what's a human being that really needs more coffee in the morning? So
Exactly.
we had a little bit of what did I need in a SOC? It's like, well, I'm going to be even more human than you guys. You're into the numbers. I want them awake and paying attention at 2 a.m. if I'm staffing at 2 a.m. We literally had a talk with one of our subsidiary companies, and I said, I want them to only play turn-based games. And they looked at me shocked and said, oh my God, how can you let people play games? And I'm like, if they have to play Minesweeper, again, showing my age, at 2 o'clock in the morning to be awake to see alerts, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with knitting. I'm not okay with reading a book. So literally coming up with what is okay and not okay in my SOC was based on what kind of behavior of the human that I needed involved. So I don't think you're ever going to get 100% of false positives and 0% false negatives. I don't think those are even the right numbers. I think it's, are we identifying and escalating the events that matter and seeing things that are, low and slow? This is why visualizations help so much. Like we had somebody in China that was traveling by rail system. We kind of figured by each IP, it was along one of their major railroads, that every time they hit a new ISP, they were doing a recon, as it was part of a whole attack, but clearly a student or something on vacay trying to figure out how to attack. .mil and .gov, for instance, used to be unavailable from .edu for the first week of summer and during winter break, just because that's when all of the IS students said, hey, I've learned how to Google hacking tools and I'm going to attack the CIA webpage. Well, it's not a big deal. The CIA webpage goes down like every other week because it's everybody's favorite attack. So measuring what you value is what really matters. Like, am I more secure today than I was yesterday, right? Are my numbers going up or are my numbers coming down? What kind of measurements did you find that you wanted to use, Jason, that actually you could show somebody the efficacy of your SOC doing something rather than just these machines are all blocking X number of alerts?
Well, and to follow up on that too, it's also about defense in depth. It's like you can't just rely on one system to get your alerting from or get your KPIs from. It's like how is the environment set up from a secure perspective? What layers do you have? Where is everything else at? You want the SOC, those guys at 2 a.m. need to kind of understand that aspect too. And you're right, having them read just puts them to sleep. I've seen it happen many times. And what we always did is we had 2 on at night shift at least, that way, so it's like they can bounce off each other and keep each other awake.
Hugely important. I had to let somebody go for napping on shift. So
Yep.
For KPIs, I mean, for us, the biggest one, like I said, was, do we have enough people to review the most log sources that we have coming in? I think that was the biggest thing. Understanding if we had too many people, like you said, if they were bored. I took an initiative where, tier 1's never going to stay with you forever. I think that's the biggest issue we have in the security field is once they're fully trained up, they do want to move on. I don't blame them. So we had a lot of pen testing initiatives where they would be involved with that, especially at night, where they could do certain things that we would have a red team for. So I think, one of my employees is actually in Rapid7 now as a senior threat person because of that. He started off as a tier 1. He trained up, he did some pen testing, got interested, did a lot of testing for us, and then moved on. So I think that was a really good goal. And, when you get a tier 1 is where do they want to go next? What do they want to learn?
Where do you ease them out if they weren't necessarily great at security analytics, but maybe they could configure boxes,
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the guys don't want to do the analyst side. They may want to do the engineering side where it's less analysis and more setting up and going that route. So yeah, definitely.
Or move them into risk. They might want the risk side over the analyst side.
Eric, what are your thoughts of KPIs where people go?
I think Jason and Bobby pretty much nailed it. I'll just say that, in every organization I've worked, they've always wanted some type of metrics. There's always false positives, but reducing those false positives to a point where the analysts aren't overwhelmed. I've definitely seen analysts get burnout based on so many false positives because the system's just not tuned correctly, or the organization hasn't identified the crown jewels, basically. And once you can reduce those false positives, you can get to the point where the analyst can actually investigate things instead of dealing with the false positive all the time. I have been the idiot that has created a rule that has, blown up a system, because leadership said we want to identify every time X, Y, and Z happens. And I go, are you sure? Because this is going to happen this many times. And then we turn it off the next day. So it's one of those things where every organization we've worked with at Exabeam has always had different ideas of what those metrics are and what is important to them. I've seen things in one environment that are not concerning, but then in another environment they are concerning. They're considered, not a false positive. So it's really getting the understanding of, what is important to them, what are the crown jewels, what are they actually trying to accomplish first, just identifying a bunch of metrics first. Yeah, I don't know if that, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I love the metric of mean time to detect to mean time to resolve because it helps you understand your efficacy. But you cannot give somebody's bonus or not based on that because you will get what we call help desk behavior of, right, if I'm being judged on how quickly I close tickets, that drives the behavior of closing tickets faster.
Exactly. Yep.
Rather than actually doing a full investigation of saying, right, I have now determined end to end in an efficient manner. I've followed my steps. I've done all the things. I am fairly certain this is or is not a danger. I've escalated or closed appropriately.
One other thing is it's about bringing in the right tools in the environment too. When you look at I'll take, for example, you could take Exabeam or you could take CrowdStrike, however you want to look at it. For me, I wanted to make it as easy as I possibly could for the SOC. If I could have a timeline of what's going on with a user or an asset and it's right there, that mean time to resolution is cut in half or 3/4 because now I've given them a tool that they can look at that is literally, it outlines everything. A lot of it is all about behavior, right? Like that's what we're doing in the SOC. So it's making sure that you have the right tools in for that environment, and not each tool is going to be right for each environment.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things that we use KPIs at the New York Stock Exchange ICE for was, situations everybody logs in to do trading for commodities, and unfortunately our name was out there, right? You want to hit the NASDAQ and NYSE and ICE to affect oil prices, right? And a lot of problems that we had with that was it would definitely break down our environment with DDoSes. And one of the KPIs that we started using was how many of those DDoS attacks do we have? How often? Because one of the initiatives that we have for project was to, have separate IPs for people like JP Morgan or different banks, right, to do trading where they would not be affected because we would block it at the source. So that's one of the KPIs that we use in security, was to understand how much DDoS, where it's coming from, could we isolate this and block that so oil commodity is not affected during the day.
And you kind of need a little bit of a before and after too. You just can't decide randomly out of the blue, now we shall have a new KPIs initiative. So like if you had a tool before, you want to gather your information of what's going on. If you're expecting my crack team of Jason, Bobby, and Eric to affect it, I need to know what were my numbers like before. And often you don't really have that realistic vision and insight. So that's why I say your KPIs need to kind of meld with your organization as you grow, as you get the tools to discover what you don't know. For instance, if you have you've set something up to be UEBA, okay, I've got my identity protection, I've got my Active Directory, I've got my PAM, I've got my SSO, and that's what I'm monitoring over here. The minute I add something like firewalls, that changes all my numbers, doesn't it? I can't just go on raw numbers. Versus I can say, what's my uptime? If my customers are demanding an SLA of 5 nines for availability, then I can say, right, how am I supporting that? How is my mission supporting that? I have stopped this many attacks. I have capped it down. I have a closure rate without recidivism, if that makes sense. Like I've closed this issue and it didn't pop again, reopen. That's what you can matter and measure on pretty well. All right, let's see. Moving on to our next one.
There's a on the KPI question from Antonio.
That was good. I was trying to answer for you, Antonio. Is the 100%, false positives, 0% false negatives. That is a super hard thing to measure because how do you know? Are you 100% that you have all of the stack that you need to see everything that can possibly happen versus what are you getting monitored? The reason I love talking about service attacks is we all remember things like the HVAC attack that took down, I think it was Target. Somebody got hacked through their smart devices, smart thing, the fish tank. Somebody got horrible human being figured out how to hack a coffee machine. This is why you can't maybe see everything, but this is why we monitor service accounts. This is why we continue to monitor, which is why I don't think you're going to get to 0 or 100%. I don't think they're real numbers. I think it's more talking about of things that happen, can you contain them? So a little bit of that is playbooks and escalations. Do you know what to do in anything? How do you get your playbooks together? And how do you figure out your escalation paths? Jason, you're putting it all together. You're building a SOC. How do you start with that?
I think it goes back to what you said earlier, is it mean time to detection, right? That's where the first KPI starts. How soon did it take to detect that alert? Take a command and control server, for instance. If somebody has a connection to a command and control server, you're not going to see that on the network frequently. It's going to be a low and slow thing, and you're going to see it maybe beacon once a day or once every 72 hours in between that time frame. So it's, how do you detect that? How do you look at that KPI? You have to look at everything. You have to look at everything almost individually sometimes.
Yeah, I would go back and, not being a jerk, but I would go back and kind of almost audit some of the closures of some of the tickets and go through some of the incidents and say, basically the alerts that the analyst triaged or the MSSP triaged, and I would go back through them and I'd say, okay, take a couple, sample them and say, okay, these were false positives. These weren't. Why were these closed out? Like this should have been more of an active investigation and more information in that ticket. So then I'd go back to the analyst and kind of review that with them and, open up an investigation from there, or just kind of lead to training opportunities or, understanding of why that shouldn't have been closed and it should have been pushed up to, a tier 2 or tier 3 analyst, or the MSSP should have forwarded that on to me for investigation. It wasn't, to make sure I'm monitoring them. It was more, to track and understand what was happening with those investigations so that I could further understand if, the metrics were correct or if it was something I needed to identify as these shouldn't be closures, these should have been pushed up to us.
Yeah, and this
And
topic kind of goes into our next program too. So I'm not going to go fully into this, but it comes down to your playbooks, right? Um, Whenever you had a situation where you had an incident or a security task, right? Um, Usually a SOC analyst should be able to follow that guide and do that. Now, we all know that security changes dramatically daily or even minutes, right? There can be a new type of attack. You might not have that playbook, so your KPIs will definitely be off of that. And it's not always the tier one's job to build those playbooks because they might not understand the attack vector or understand what's going on. So KPIs are great for understanding certain things, but sometimes they just don't catch it all.
Yep. And to kind of piggyback off Eric too, is that one thing when you're looking at previous cases and things like that, it's also a way to evaluate yourself from a management perspective to make sure, hey, am I training these guys in a way that they're grasping it and they understand, and what can I do to improve to help them grow? It's our job it's the job as a manager to create or to develop those employees or those analysts to be better than you were, and to get you and to elevate you past where you're at. And that's huge.
I want to throw one small anecdote to close up this whole idea because I was a, SOC shift lead, tech lead. When it hit a point, I went into my manager and threw myself onto his couch and like, how do I make them care? And he laughed, this wise old uncle laughed and said, I wondered when you were going to come. He says, Jeannie, the problem is you're really smart and you have all the answers. You're giving them processes, you're giving them a solution, but they don't own it. And that little one light bulb I want to give to all of you of going out and saying, hey guys, you're my night crew. I need these reports getting done and they're not really getting done. And we've missed 2 of these. I'd like you guys to form a committee and tell me how you're going to solve it. And let them do the work of figuring out their own process and procedure. And if they can come up with something that's 85% or better, what I was trying to tell them, but it was their cunning plan, not me just handing it to them, then they own it. How to get people to own what's going on is absolutely huge. And yes, there's a little bit of psychology involved, but don't just hand down all the solutions. Don't just hand down all the mandates out there. Give these to your team a little bit and say, all right, what do you think? How do we measure this? Because then they're part of the solution. They own the solution and they'll execute more towards the solution that they own. And that was the lesson I learned from my failure running a SOC. And I hope that you guys, when I was a senior and I had to teach my manager, I'm like, again, you're very smart. You're handing down all the solutions. You're handing down all the processes. Make them come up with a process. Tell them, hey, there's a problem with our reports. Our customers aren't getting, full value, or they don't see and understand, or you guys are very smart, but you're writing this as if the reader was very smart. I need you to explain things better. I need you to say, hey, here's the whatis.com link to all of the things that you're about to tell them about. So I just wanted to throw out there for the psychology of managing your people, helping them own the solution. Don't just hand everything down to them is an excellent way to get them involved and invested rather than just involved, is invested into the solution. It's an old Scrum term, but it matters a lot. Be the pig, not just the chicken.
We've got 3 minutes left, so we can wrap it up here. If there's any last questions or any last thoughts.
Have we answered everybody's question?
I think we did in a roundabout way this last one that was, as a SOC manager, how to link productivity KPIs to risk potential and loss quantification to track the SOC ROI.
I think that's beautiful, but my first section is, are they all awake? Are we catching the alerts? Are we getting and closing tickets more effectively and efficiently? I think is the first one. And there isn't an absolute, you're never going to cross a finish line and be done. You are truly not, because there's always going to be some new thing to hack, and it may not have a security tool looking at it yet. You don't know your full security stack because hardly anybody, here's 50 security tools looking at things, and here's a company that's got 10. What are you monitoring? What are you seeing? The object is to get best cases you can, to understand what the most important things are, what the most important IDs, what the most important service accounts, what are the primary, how do I protect my repositories, my property, and my people? And if I'm working a machine floor, I care that nobody hacks my robots and injures a human, which matters to me a lot more than if I just have to report and pay money. For instance, I know there was a large HMO that paid $8 million because paying the fine for a HIPAA violation was cheaper than in putting a solution in. And sometimes the people at our level in a SOC aren't the ones that make that decision. So we just kind of have to be there to pick up the pieces, and giving that flexibility of understanding to your people. And this is what we're trying to achieve, is what's going to do that.
Perfect. All right, so we're going to wrap it up here. I want to thank my panelists so much for this. We are going to be having more in this series. Our next one, we pushed into May just for scheduling issues. But I will be sending out the link to register for that one. We're going to be delving more into niche topics. There will be at least 3 more of these coming up within this year, with many more panelists as well. I should have this recording up on the community in about an hour. You will receive an email in 24 hours with the direct link to the recording and the archive, as well as a link to register for the upcoming event. And I have also in the chat, if you haven't gotten a chance to see, we have a customer call coming up tomorrow. This will be at 2 p.m. Pacific. It's a really great opportunity to meet with your peers, bounce off questions and solutions with each other. And we've had people find that very helpful. So if you have time to register for that, we'd love to see you. Lastly, there will be a survey at the end of this call. I know we're all really fond of surveys. It will take about 3 seconds to fill out, and it does let us know how you like this new format, and if there's anything we can improve on for our next one. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Antonio. We really appreciate all of your questions. Thank you guys so much, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks for putting it together, Tim.
Thank
you.